एलर्टन साहब से पूछे कि उनको आवाज आ रही है कि नहीं आ रही, प्लीज डॉक्टर पीटर से पूछ लें प्लीज.
Sir, are you listening us? Sir,
Ask him again.
Sir, are you listening us?
Hello, yes, I am. I'm sorry, I had to step out for a bit.
Sure.
But yes, I am. I can hear you. All the sound is very good. Thank you.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's session of PAS. I'm Doha Faiz, doing BS in English Literature and Language from Government Girls Degree College, Nusheira, Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, Pakistan. Today, we are here again in another wonderful webinar organized by PAS. So PAS stands for Professors Association for Student Services. It's an academic and volunteer association that aims to promote critical thinking and scientific research culture through seminar, conferences in academia of Pakistan and across the world. So today's webinar is also being conducted to attempt to achieve aim of PAS. Before moving forward, I would like to share today's format of session. The entire session would be engaged for about 1.5 hours that comprise of 4 sections. First, talk of a respected speaker that would be of 40 to 45 minutes. The other section will be of question answer session that would be of 15 to 20 minutes. The third section would be of concluding remarks of the speaker. At last, we will be having word of thanks from President PAS. The main purpose of this webinar is to learn, to unlearn, to understand importance of inquisitiveness in our academic lives and especially in research field, and how to create balance in our reasoning. Let me tell you that a recorded version of this webinar will be available on official Facebook page of PAS and on YouTube channel of PAS as well. It's an honor for PAS that we have one of the renowned guest speaker. I would like to briefly introduce him. Dr. Peter Ellerton, Director of University of Queensland Critical Thinking Project Australia, Senior Lecturer, School of Historical and Philosophical Inquiry, and Senior Lecturer, School of Education. Mr. Peter's area of focus include public reasoning, science communication, argumentation, and critical thinking in education. He has delivered professional development in teaching for thinking throughout Australia. And internationally, and has been invited to deliver program at University of California, Los Angeles, Pepperdine, University Los Angeles, and Simon Fraser University in Canada. Mr. Peter's passion is working with education to enable a teaching for thinking focus across all year levels and subject areas. As a learner, I think that the most important barrier in understanding critical thinking is the perception that we still do not understand the concept well enough to determine how skills of critical thinking can be integrated in our curriculum. So this paralysis derives partly from debates within the supporters of critical thinking or the exact definition of critical thinking. However, thoughtful and constructive debates to develop a consensus regarding what the skills to constitute critical thinking and how these skills can be taught successfully. Simply, critical thinking involves critical thinking in a structured way. The term commonly used to describe this form of productive structured thinking is logical. But logic describes a number of systems for a reasoning systematically. We have therefore requested Dr. Peter Ellerton to clarify in this context. Now, we would love to hear from you, respected speaker, please.
Okay, thank you very much for that introduction, and thank you all for having me here today. I hope my outrageous Australian accent doesn't make things too difficult in terms of understanding. I'm very happy to be here to speak to you about the concept of critical thinking and to try and get a better understanding of not only what we mean by critical thinking, but how we might teach it. And I suppose a lot of this depends quite strongly on the assumption that there is a thing called critical thinking that's sort of out there, or whether it's just something that we've had a vague understanding of and really haven't defined well in our own understanding. So it's an interesting project to try and understand critical thinking. But let's give it a go from our perspective. So I am going to begin, if I can share my slides in a little bit, I'll begin by speaking about a number of aspects of critical thinking and some of the assumptions that people often have about critical thinking. And then I will lead from those assumptions to some ideas about whether it can or can't be taught, and if so, how it is going to be or ought to be taught. I'll then share some ideas and resources that we use in our own teaching networks, so that we can see some of those ideas in place in the resources, and then open up for conversation after that for a little bit. So I believe I'll talk for about 45 minutes, and then we'll have 15 minutes or so for questions. I think I understand that. Okay. So do bear with me, and I may look like I'm going off topic a little bit sometimes, but I'm always going to bring it back to the key questions. So I'll share my screen to begin, and sorry for all the other stuff that's on my screen. It's been a busy day. And I will speak first and foremost, oops, I'll go back to the beginning here. First and foremost about, I'll start this way, by introducing myself and tell you something of my history. I have been for about 10 years working at the University of Queensland on the project of understanding and teaching critical thinking. We have networks of educators involved in this through a number of places from North America, including Canada and the US, in Singapore, some parts of Europe, and indeed South Africa as well. So everybody is interested in critical thinking and how it can be taught. But before that 10 years at the university, I was a high school teacher for about 20 years. And my focus was in science and mathematics. I have a master's degree in physics. And it's kind of strange that I am now working as a philosopher. Some people might find it a bit odd. But if we want to learn about how we think, we can learn a lot from psychology or from cognitive science, perhaps. But if we want to learn about how we ought to think, that is, what makes for good thinking, well, psychology and cognitive science are reasonably silent on that. The questions of what makes for good reasons are usually philosophical questions. So that's why I now work in the area of philosophy. Let me begin by posing some key questions that I like to start with. And these questions are very commonly used in our networks. They kind of help us frame the conversation. So the first question in terms of the teaching of critical thinking, I'd like to ask is how do you know students are thinking in your classroom? Now, I'm not going to immediately answer these questions, but I'm rather putting them there to get you thinking about it. What would your answers be to that question? What would your students' answers be to that question? What would your colleagues' answers be to that question? What do you think they would say? Not only the question, how do you know the students are thinking in your classroom, but what kind of thinking might they be doing? Indeed, how can we categorize the kinds of thinking that they might be doing? All these questions are very interesting ones for us to consider. The second question I then postulate is, how do you plan for that thinking to occur? Doubtless you do, but the question is, what does it look like, that planning? We're very used to planning in great detail for the content that we wish to cover, but how do we plan for the thinking we wish to occur? What kind of words do we use, and what kind of conversations do we have with ourselves and with our colleagues? And the third question is a very critical one, and it's one that's not often asked, but I think it's one of the most important. So given that we understand what students are doing when they're thinking, given then that we might be planning for that to happen, the final question is, how do you give students feedback on the quality of their thinking? Not just on how they're progressing through the task and what specific information you can give them about the mechanics of the task, but actually the quality of their thinking as they go through their task. What language do we have? What words do we have to do that? So there are three useful questions to consider, and how we answer those will depend very much on how we understand critical thinking. So I've said already critical and creative thinking, and I am going to talk a little bit about creative thinking because I think you have to if we are talking about critical thinking. They are found in most state and national curricula around the world. It seems to be a reasonably universal quality that is desirable, but they're also very ill-defined, and therefore they're very difficult to operationalize. How can you put into action some concept of teaching critical thinking if we're not clear on what it is? I think that's an obvious statement. So understanding what we mean by these things is therefore an important step on the path to developing learning experiences, because different conceptualizations of critical thinking imply different approaches. So it's not just that we are or we are not. We might be, but we might be looking at it in very different ways. So we need to get this right, or at least understand in as much detail as possible how we might go about doing it. Now, in the Australian context, if I can share this with you, we have what we call general capabilities in our national curriculum. And one of the general capabilities is critical and creative thinking, which includes some of the things that you can see on the screen here, the reflecting on thinking and processes, inquiring, identifying, exploring and organizing information and ideas, generating ideas, possibilities and actions, analyzing, synthesizing and evaluating reasoning and procedures, and so on. And these things are elaborated in quite some detail in the documentation. But importantly, they've grouped critical and creative thinking together. So I want to have a little bit of a talk on that first off. I think it's important to appreciate that when we speak about creative thinking, that we are talking about processes that involve skills and dispositions. It's very difficult to talk about critical and creative thinking without talking about the thinker themselves. We're not going to be talking about some skill that sits in isolation from the person. We have to be also talking about the person that engages in that skill. I would say that if you were an athletics coach, it wouldn't be much sense. Say you were coaching something like the javelin. it wouldn't make much sense to just talk about the javelin. You have to talk a lot about the person who is throwing the javelin as well. So in that sense, we have to talk a lot about the thinker, as well as the kind of thinking we wish them to do. But speaking specifically about creative thinking, it is best understood as a process. There is a lot of creativity in coming up with interesting questions and seeing connections and insights. But when we speak about creative thinking or creativity in the literature, most experts in the area speak of it as a process, as of creating something at an endpoint that wasn't there before. And that process that we see in entrepreneurship and business and in science involves a lot of creativity, but it also demands criticality. So there's a really important connection between critical and creative thinking that we have to consider. I might offer as an example of this something that's very well known in the business literature, which is the innovation diamond or double diamond model, where we can see periods of divergent thinking where we're getting some very interesting and creative thinking going on to generate ideas and possibilities. But then we have to be critical in the process of defining what we mean by those terms and deciding which of these ideas are going to be the best ones to go forward. Then we may have to engage in some more divergent thinking as we develop these ideas, trying to see what the best ways are of developing them. But we must then converge to a point, to a final solution, engaging in a lot of evaluation and critical thinking as we go through. So we can see cycles of creativity and criticality that come together all the time. And I think it's a very dangerous business to try and talk just about critical thinking without talking a lot about creative thinking as well. So an important connection to be seen there. If I was to go into some of those skills that we see at those divergent and convergent areas, I might represent them like this. So we can see that we have some divergent phases on the left-hand side and those convergent phases on the right-hand side. And I've got what I've called cognitions in play here. In the divergent phases, we're getting students, ourselves, whoever it might be, to generate questions, to infer from complete data, to hypothesize logical or causal connections, to conjecture alternative frames and perspectives, or speculate if you like, to generate alternatives, to create options and opportunities. So there's a lot of creative work involved in that. And we want to be very clear that this is actually a highly cognitive process. We're not just throwing the dice and hoping something happens here. We're engaged in some very specific cognitive activity, even in that creative divergent phase. On the right-hand side of the cognitions in play, where we're at those evaluative phases, trying to make decisions about how we might move forwards, we're engaged in explaining concepts and relationships, in analyzing problems and solutions, to justify the approaches that we might take and develop and construct arguments for those, to synthesize information and ideas and organize information, of course, and interpret that information to make meaning and value. And at the bottom of that table, I've got what I've called values of inquiry, which I'll talk about later. On the left-hand side in those divergent phases, we're developing breadth, we're growing depth, and we're encouraging inclusivity. And these are very important ideas in creativity, depth, breadth, and inclusivity, to maximize how we can work together collaboratively, something he'll talk about again. On the right-hand side, in those evaluative critical thinking phases, we're seeking clarity, we're developing precision in our language, in our thinking. We're trying to be as accurate as possible. We are valuing coherence as we look at different phases of the project. We're explaining why we think things are significant or relevant to the process. It's often what we mean when we say discerning, to explain why things are significant and relevant. And we're striving for simplicity as well. So we can see all the cognitive activity that's involved in those creative and critical processes as we're going through a process to develop something new. So this is a very organic idea, but it's also very grounded in so much of human endeavor, trying to create something that wasn't there before, and the central role of critical and creative thinking in making that happen. And our ability to be specific about what kind of skills we're talking about, as I've outlined there, is very important in teaching it. But if I could move towards just speaking a bit about critical thinking now, getting in a bit more deeply into critical thinking. Critical thinking, there are a range of different processes which you can call critical thinking. There's no one process of critical thinking. It's something that our ability to analyze and evaluate and justify is something that we call into play in many, many ways. There's no real algorithmic process for critical thinking. I don't think there's one way that you can say is the way of developing a process for critical thinking. But it does involve skills, and it does involve dispositions. So it does involve the character of the thinker as well. And I'll talk about that a bit as we go on. But it does demand creativity. So I just want to make that connection again between the two things. So let me go into some detail now about how we might conceptualize critical thinking, making the point that without creativity, critical thinking is in danger of being reduced to simply a rule-following or algorithmic analytic process. And if it was just such a rule-following progress, it would be trivial to teach. We'd just teach people the process and that would be the end of it. But of course, it's not like that, as we all know. So the creativity that we're looking for, that we might see as fundamental to critical thinking, and I'm still talking about critical thinking here. So I'm saying in our critical thinking approaches, we have to come up with new and novel solutions or perspectives and generate questions that will help us to do that. We have to identify and test our assumptions. And we have to frame problems and situations in ways that make innovative solutions possible. I think one of the strongest abilities of a critical thinker is to challenge assumptions and to create new framings, new ways of looking at things, so that we have new opportunities that are presented to us. Now, I'd like to look at two very broad conceptions of critical thinking, and both exist in the literature. And I think one of them has a lot more credibility than the other, but they are both out there, and I'll talk about those. One conception is that we see critical thinking as a general skill that is kind of innate within us, but it is not open to educational influences directly. In this view, you cannot teach critical thinking. What you can do is develop students' discipline knowledge and content knowledge. And in doing so, our innate critical thinking abilities come out, however that may be. So in this view, critical thinking is not something we teach. Indeed, it's unteachable. But if we pay attention to developing good content knowledge, then the critical thinking skills that we are presumably born with will be able to develop. So we have to look at how we do that. The other way of conceptualizing critical thinking is to see it as a mix of knowledge about our discipline area, yes, but also about thinking, and a range of skills and dispositions, and possibly virtues, which are embedded in the thinker themselves. Now, I'm going to explore both of these a bit, but I will say from the outset that I think that the first conception is incorrect. I think there's just so much evidence against it. But you will find that there is a large body of work in some areas of educational psychology, and particularly in cognitive load theory, which will say that it is a waste of time to teach critical thinking. And that has a lot of traction throughout the world, but I believe that to be incorrect, because there are sufficient counterexamples in the literature to show that. In the context of cognitive load theory as one of the general skill idea, this is something from the psychologist John Sweller. It's seen as primitive. Now, by primitive, what they mean is a type of knowledge that we are born with. And I think they're mixing it up with some sense of intelligence. I'm not quite sure how they see this. They see there are two types of knowledge, primitive and secondary. And the secondary knowledge is almost everything we teach in school, history and mathematics and science and what have you. But the primitive knowledge is a bit like language. You don't have to teach language directly. We will develop the sense of language. And they think that critical thinking is like this. And it's the complexity of our domain knowledge that allows for and activates our sophisticated thinking. In this sense, the way I would phrase it is that critical thinking can be coaxed out of us. It can be encouraged, but it can't be coached directly. The other way of looking at critical thinking is as a mix of skills and dispositions. Skills such as analysis, justification, and evaluation, and many more. Dispositions such as open-mindedness, perseverance, honesty, humility, and tolerance of other perspectives. They are aspects of the character and the thinker. And still, with the character of the thinker, an appreciation of the role that the values of inquiry, such as clarity and precision and relevance and significance and depth and breadth of treatment and coherence, all play in our inquiry, an active role in our inquiry to do that. In the Australian context, and I'll share this with you again, we see in our curriculum, at least, that critical thinking is a set of knowledge, skills, and behaviours and dispositions. So we take that broad mix of skills. I will take the trouble to say that the view that you can only teach critical thinking by teaching discipline knowledge depends a bit on the idea that you have to be thinking about something, to be thinking critical. And so many of our problems demand discipline knowledge to solve and deep discipline knowledge to solve, that it doesn't make sense to be talking about critical thinking without that knowledge. Now, even if that were true, it doesn't mean to say that content knowledge is sufficient or enough to a particular problem. All it says is that you might need some content knowledge, but there's nothing about that assumption that means that critical thinking can't be taught, or that there is something else also involved in the process of good problem solving. So just because we might need some content knowledge to solve some problems, it doesn't mean that there isn't a thing called critical thinking outside that. So we'll try and make that clear. So if we see, just look at those two ideas again, if we see critical thinking as a general skill, then the best thing to do is to teach complex discipline knowledge. That's the best approach if we see it. And don't worry about critical thinking, it will happen by itself. We present novel and difficult problems to solve and give students an opportunity to think critically, so long as they have lots and lots of discipline knowledge. Thinking in this model is a byproduct of education. It's something that happens if you do the other stuff properly. If you see critical thinking as a mix of skills and dispositions, then you still teach complex discipline knowledge. There's no reason not to teach complex discipline knowledge. It's important to do that. You still present novel and difficult problems to solve, but you also make the quality of student thinking an object of study in the classroom. And that's the difference between these two approaches. On the one hand, you just don't worry about critical thinking. On the other hand, you do. So it depends on your assumptions about critical thinking here. And I'm going to follow this path in which we are looking at the quality of student thinking and try and understand what that means and how we can properly develop it. So teaching critical thinking then is making the quality of student thinking an object of study in the classroom, as much as you are making the content that you're working on, your discipline knowledge, an object of study. So you might be teaching physics, but you're also concerned with how well students teach, or you're teaching history, but you're still concerned about how well students think, I should say, think. So behind all of this, behind an essential ingredient to teach students to think well, is that we need to develop hypotheses regarding what will work and why. We need to have some idea in our minds about what we are doing and why we are doing it. Ultimately, teaching people to think well is about the pedagogy of the classroom. It's not necessarily about the curriculum. It is about how we teach people to think that matters. So that's an interesting challenge to talk about. So I'd like to talk a little bit about cognitive skills first off, to see what it is that we are testing. So the student thinking in the classroom has to be an object of study for teachers. So we need to know how I am or how what I do in the classroom influences how my students will think. I have to have a very clear idea of cause and effect between my actions and my students' thinking. It's a very important idea. And let me talk a little bit here about Bloom's taxonomy first. And the reason I'm going to talk to you about Bloom's taxonomy is that it's wrong, but it is still used in classrooms today, and it's still very, very prominent in education today, even including in my university. But I will explain why it's wrong and explain the damage that it can do. It has had a very long history in education, and we owe it a debt of gratitude because it has given us some words to talk about student thinking, to create, evaluate, analyze, apply, etc., that have been very useful. But it's a hierarchy model. It suggests that one skill is in some sense a higher order skill than other skills. So create is higher order than evaluate, which is higher order than apply, or whatever it might be. Now, there's a problem with that. Now, and the problem is, it shows that there's in fact, well, several problems, but one is this, that this is from Robert Mazzano's new taxonomy book. Robert Mazzano from, as you might know, from Art and Science of Teaching or Dimensions of Learning. The notion of a hierarchy simply isn't supported by the research. And Bloom knew this himself. You don't have to take my word, you can take Bloom's word for it. And so does Mazzano and many others, in fact. It saw that the research conducted on the taxonomy did not support a hierarchy. So educators who were trained in the structure of Bloom's were constantly unable to recognize questions at higher level as more difficult than questions at lower levels of the taxonomy. And it becomes clear when you understand examples like this. We might think, for example, that analyze is a higher order skill than categorize. But you have to sometimes, in fact, almost always, you have to analyze before you can categorize. You will always find examples of evaluate that are very difficult, but also examples of evaluate which are very easy. There's nothing innately of themselves higher or lower order in the skill. It is all about the context. So evaluate need not be a higher order, more difficult, more complex, more demanding thinking task than analyze at all. There are many cases where it's far worse. And if I could even use examples like identify. Identify can be very, very difficult, involving a lot of these skills that you have to go through before you can properly identify something. So we have to move away from the idea that there is a hierarchy of cognitive skills and this concept of higher order thinking. In fact, they're all important, and whether or not one is more demanding than another often depends on the task, But even within a task, they can be highly interconnected, and you're not doing one just by itself. We also do not want to think of these skills as being constituted by other skills. So I think it's a mistake to say that if we want to create, we first have to remember, understand, apply, analyze, and evaluate before we can create. It doesn't work that way. We can point to any number of examples where we can get people to evaluate something without applying or doing something, without sequencing, organizing, identifying, all of those other cognitive verbs that are so common. So we have to move on from the concept of a taxonomy if we now want to progress a bit further on. And these words are important because they describe aspects of student thinking that we think are important in the classroom. So where can we go if we don't have a cognitive model, a model of Bloom? In our teaching networks, we utilize what we call the cognitive web model, where we understand the cognitions as being nodes on a web. And if you pull on one of those, you will pull on many others because they're connected to each other. They're very strongly connected to each other. And we don't do them in isolation. We always do them with regard to each other. And it is a far more accurate way to understand how the cognitions are related to each other rather than in a hierarchy. They're sort of all connected in this way. But there is a problem if we think of them as a web. The problem is, well, which ones do we focus on? Because at least Bloom's gave us the idea of higher order. We could just focus on a few. But if they're all important, what do we focus on? And it's here that we come across the idea of the golden tetrad of skills. We would use the skills of analysis and explanation and justification and evaluation. And we would suggest that if you focus on those 4 skills, that you pull in almost all the other skills over time. So that are we ensuring that the activities we're giving to our students demand of them these skills? Do they have to analyze, explain, justify, and evaluate particular aspects of their knowledge and the claims they are making about their knowledge? And we find this is a very useful way to organize our classrooms to make sure that good thinking is occurring. And I'll just, we still use the word evaluate because it's a very important skill in decision making. We use justify because it's very important in the context of argumentation. And we know argumentation is a very powerful tool in the classroom for developing student thinking. Analyze is there because it's just so fundamental to so many of the skills we want to apply. And explain is there because explain is the cognitive skill most closely associated with the concept of understanding. And we want students to understand many concepts in our discipline contexts. So it's important that they be able to explain those concepts to us just by way of explanation. I'll just use this diagram to explain what I mean. In fact, that the knowledge on the left there is meant to indicate, or the diagram on the left is meant to indicate knowledge which is disconnected, just individual facts or bits of information we give to students. And the knowledge on the right is meant to indicate how that knowledge hangs together or sits together. And it speaks to relational aspects of the knowledge or dynamic aspects of the knowledge. And it's for that kind of knowledge we reserve the word understand. So that if you were watching, for example, as we often do down here, say a cricket game, I could give you a list of names of cricket players, and you could, but I wouldn't say, do you understand the list? It's not how we use the word understand. I might just say, do you know it's a list of cricket players? But I wouldn't ask you to understand the list. But if you were watching a game of cricket, I would say, do you understand what you're seeing? Because there's all that relational dynamic work between the parts. And the cognitive verb most closely associated with understand is explain, because understand itself is not a cognitive verb. It's a state we want students to attain. We want them to have that knowledge of that particular kind of knowledge. But explain requires an understanding of the relational aspects, whereas describe, for example, as a cognitive skill, does not. So we can be very precise about our language in this term. And we can see that if we focus on those four, we can bring in lots of other skills in different contexts. So they're very powerful things to have in the classroom as critical thinking activities very often. And I'll make these slides available to you, but just to explain the relationship between them, there are many ways to understand this. So this is something perhaps you could look at later on. I don't think we have time to go through all of these here, but I can say very, very quickly, the quality of our explanation and our depth of understanding depends on the depth and breadth of our analysis. If we analyze something properly, we get a better understanding of it. We are therefore better able to explain it. Very often the strength of a justification is the function of the quality of our analysis. So someone says, how can you justify that? You might draw on your analysis of similar situations to say, well, it's worked in these situations, so I think it will work in this situation. And so I'm very conscious of the relationship when I say this about the justification analysis and so on. There's other ways to look at that between those four skills. They make a very strong connection, and they demand of students that thinking is happening. It's not enough to just recall or state or list in these ones. I also want to spend a little bit of time, just conscious of time as we talk about it, talking about the concept of what we value in inquiry. So we talk about inquiring, and we're using this set of skills to inquire into the world, but there's more to it than that. And I have a list of things that we might talk about as values of inquiry. Elder and Paul talk about these in the literature as standards, but I think values is a better word for them, because they are ways in which, if we talk about them as value, think about that word evaluate. At the core of the word evaluate is the word value. Because if we wish to evaluate something, we have to know what we value about it, which allows us to construct the criteria for evaluation. So what do we value in inquiry and therefore in thinking? And there are words like clarity, accuracy, precision, and depth and breadth and relevance and significance and so on. These are just some of the words that some of the things we value in student thinking. And I've made an attempt to describe what I might mean by each of these things on the sides of these. I'll just move to a larger screen so you can see this. So for example, with clarity, when we communicate with clarity, we ensure our audience can understand what we mean. We're making these points as clear as possible. And there are questions that we can ask students or give students to ask themselves about their work to see whether or not it's clear enough. Are the examples useful? Is the argument structure clear? Are the diagrams easy to understand? Well-structured paragraphs, well-defined words, etc., etc. These are just some of the questions I ask my postgraduate students in critical thinking. There are many other questions you could ask about clarity, or accuracy, or precision, which is the one whose word is cut off at the bottom there. Those words are very important, and those arguments are important. I'll show you where you can download this later on. Or depth and breadth. So, for example, for breadth, I can say, have you considered alternative perspectives? Or presented a broad range of views? Why did you prefer one perspective over another? Can you tell me why that's the case? And have you sought out other people for the purposes of testing your ideas so that you can get a breadth of ideas and breadth of feedback? Or for relevance, why do you think that matters? It's a very important idea for students to be able to describe. And the same thing for significance. Well, they all might matter, but which one matters most? And why do you think that's the case? And in doing so, they show their understanding as they demonstrate why they think something is significant. This is a very important word, a very common word in our criteria sheets is the word discerning. but to show that someone is thinking well, they're discerning. But what is discerning if not being able to demonstrate what is significant and relevant and being able to explain why? So all of these things present us with ways in which we can evaluate student thinking and give them feedback on the quality of their thinking as they go through. So that's one package that I can talk about in a bit. I've mentioned collaborate a couple of times here, and I have to make a point. I think that collaboration is the absolute key to the teaching of critical thinking. For a very important reason. The analogy I will use is that it's like learning a language. You can't learn a language by yourself. You can't just, as we all know, we can't sit in a room with a book about the language and have that book teach us how to speak the language properly. We have to speak it with other people. It's the only way we can do it, because we have to determine whether or not we're developing shared meaning. And I think the same thing is true about thinking, because thinking together is about understanding, developing shared meaning. What do you mean by that? And why is that important? And it's developing shared meaning that can only happen collaboratively. That when we think together, we engage in a kind of social cognition, which is far more powerful than individual cognition, but it also teaches us the norms of good thinking. In exactly the same way that we understand how languages ought to be spoken by speaking them with other people, we understand what makes for good reasoning by reasoning with other people. Cognitive scientist Dan Sperber notes that because of this social aspect of reasoning, we reason with each other and towards each other, that reasoning is best understood as a social competence rather than an individual faculty. And this is a very important idea. So when we collaborate, it allows students to understand and develop the norms of effective thinking. So what makes for good reasons, and how do we know that? That's something that we understand in our conversations, in our thinking with each other. It is a form of social cognition in which the limits of our cognition are not those of the individual, but of the group, which is a very powerful idea. And we can also share our working memory amongst the group to become far more proficient than we would otherwise. And we understand that feedback is a necessary condition for improving experiential knowledge, that is, the knowledge of how to do something. And we can use our interactions to give ourselves feedback on the quality of our thinking. In learning how to do thinking, which is something we have to do, we have to be able to get feedback as we do it. And that's where collaboration is very powerful as well. So that effective thinking is really understood as a combination of many things, of critical thinking, of creative thinking, of collaboration, communication, and the personal and social skills which make that communication and that collaboration possible. So I think we have to conceptualize critical thinking as a very broad thing, which deals with the character of the people and the culture of the classroom in which we operate as well. So these are important ideas. Now, I just want to talk about the cognitions very quickly, about just for 5 minutes, and that's going to be my time finished. Very important, showing you how the values of inquiry can relate to cognitions. I can give you an example. So this is a very simplified assessment item template for assessing thinking. So when we talk about the cognitive skills of explain and analyze and justify and evaluate, we can bring the values of inquiry to bear as ways to evaluate the thinking. When we talk about our explanations, we can speak about the clarity of it, the accuracy of it, the precision of it, the depth of the explanation, the breadth of it, the coherence, etc., etc. And we can use those words for all of those skills. They work for different skills very easily. Now, we've actually done this as a proof of concept for a whole range of particular skills. So you can see here, this is a critical thinking matrix, and I'll show you where you can download this I'll give you the web address to download this, where we filled out a whole bunch of skills and a whole bunch of values, so that if I zoom in a little bit so you can see it a bit more clearly, for example, this is the skill of categorizing, which I spoke about earlier. So what does it mean to categorize with clarity? Well, the criteria that we use for categorizing are unambiguous, and the common characteristics of the elements are explicitly stated. I won't do them all. What about precision? Well, categorical distinctions are based on quantifiable data, specific characteristics or logical definitions. So that means we're very precise in how we categorize. Sometimes we don't want to use quantifiable. Sometimes we want to use quantifiable aspects like color, but quantity is sometimes important. In depth, we want to categorize using significant and relevant characteristics, not superficial ones. So we wouldn't say categorize a dolphin and a shark as the same thing, because even though superficially they may look similar, they're very different underneath. Or for breadth, we might say, well, what are the alternative perspectives for criteria? Because we can categorize things in many, many different ways. So why would we choose one way above another? There are different ways we could categorize, and so on. You can see all these being used. But if you look down at the bottom of this, there's self-regulation. And across at the end here, the value of breadth in that is a willingness to modify thinking through collaborative inquiry. We're willing to modify our thinking by seeking out others to test our thinking. And we see self-correction as progress. Wouldn't it be nice if our students always saw self-correction or moving as progress towards a particular end? So there's all sorts of ways to understand these values as it applies to the cognitive skills. And this gives us a way of understanding, or some words to talk about student thinking with rigor. Because I think we will find that rigor sits in student thinking, it doesn't sit in content. Or if it does sit in content, it sits in content because it demands these skills of students. That just gives you an indication. There is the matrix writ large, and there is a website down below from which you can download that. And I think there's around that website page too, there is a poster that you can download the values of inquiry. It looks quite different, the values of inquiry poster, from the one I showed you, but it's the same information, or the same questions at least from the values. But that website will allow you to download that matrix and those values. And I'll just, in closing, my final slide, we work in our networks with a kind of schematic approach to teaching critical thinking, which includes content and understands cognitive skills as things we do with our knowledge. So thinking is something we do with our knowledge. The values as a means of feeding back on the cognitive skills. But we're also concerned with virtues of the thinker, like open-mindedness and willingness to change perspective, to seek alternative perspectives, and perseverance, and so on. So I don't mean for that to be in itself informative, but I just wanted to point to the fact that we have a way of putting all of this together, and that's what we do in our networks. But we need not talk about that in any detail right now. So I guess that's basically it from me as a presentation. I'm happy to answer any questions that people might have, but it gives us it's very difficult to talk about critical thinking in 45 minutes, but I hope I've given you some things to think about as you've gone forward. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Speaker. It was really nice listening to you. Now the forum is open for question answer session. I would like to invite questions from participants, please. Participants can opt one of these two options, either by raising hands or chat box for asking their questions or sharing their comments. Sir, I have a question. May I ask?
Yes.
So as a researcher, how could we build an argument in our thesis writing to understand as well as explain purpose of critical thinking.
Do I understand that you're asking how you can fit argumentation into thesis writing? Yes, that is an excellent question. I have to say that one of the biggest problems with students writing a thesis, I think, is that they don't see it as an argument, that they see it as some research that they're trying to do without using the structure of an argument to pull everything together and to make a really strong point supported by all of those different ideas. So I also think it's a problem that many thesis writers and many academics don't value writing in the first person as much as they should, because I think, which doesn't mean to say that we want to start every sentence with "I think," but we do have to own our arguments and and take responsibility for our justifications. So I think we should say things like, I'm not convinced by this for these reasons, or I chose to follow this path because, and make it very clear that it's our decision, that we own this thing, and that we're not trying to pretend that it's somebody else doing the work. So I think there's an issue of accountability in writing this way. And I think argumentation helps us very powerfully to do that. By saying, this is my argument. My argument is, and I'll take my own thesis as an example. My argument is that the best way to teach critical thinking is this way, through a particular process. And here's all my reasons why I think that's the case. I know some people think this is why I find it unconvincing, and I think this is better. I'm going to give you my reasons now. So I think you make a very powerful point that when we write academically on a thesis, it's very significant that we own our arguments and we prosecute them as arguments, not just trying to push information to people and say, look at all this information. We want to say, here's the structure of it. All these things are acting as reasons for why you should accept this point at the end. And I think that's our responsibility as academics to make that push and ask that of our students as well. So thank you. It's a good question.
Thank you, sir. Is there anyone who wants to ask a question?
We have, yes, Rashid has got a question there. What do we require for analysis and assessment of arguments? And again, that's a very, very good question, because one of the things we don't teach enough in education in general is the process of argumentation, the process of moving from premises to conclusions, the distinction between inductive and deductive arguments, the use of analogy and generalizations and what makes those more persuasive and less persuasive, using the conditional statement, or using words like necessary and sufficient conditions, I think are very powerful devices, but they're all linked to argumentation. And critically, words like valid and sound to determine whether or not an argument makes logical sense and whether or not there's any truth to the claims that it makes. So I think we actually do a full day workshop on the identification, analysis, construction, and evaluation of arguments. It takes us a full day to go through the whole lot. So there is a lot there. So while it's an excellent question, I don't feel like I can give a full answer to that. But we do want to look at the strength of the justification for any particular claim. And we want to interrogate that link between the reasons of the justification and the conclusion. And there's just, we analyze papers in science and engineering and humanities a lot. We do a lot of analysis of academic papers, and we find many, many instances of faulty reasoning and poor arguments, even though people might know their content area very well. So there's lots of ways to do that, but it's a small question, but it's a very big answer. But I can't really give too much of it, but that's something at least I can say.
Thank you so much, sir. We have Sir Shahid Khan who wants to ask question. Yes, sir. So kindly unmute yourself. Yes, sir.
Hello, are you getting my voice?
Yes, it's clear.
Yes.
Okay, how are you?
Well, thank you.
So I'm a teacher of philosophy. I've been teaching philosophy for last 6 to 7 years, and especially I teach critical thinking to students of business and other social sciences. So when it comes to application of critical thinking, especially in Muslim country that I am in, there is a problem that I need a kind of maybe a guidance or maybe a complete answer. And the problem is teaching causation to Muslims who believe in the will of God. And when you talk about will of God, they believe everything happens because of the will of God. But in scientific knowledge, you have the idea of causation, which has no apparent reference to the will of God. So if I'm right, there is apparent contradiction between these two ideas. So how do you suggest to teach the idea of causation to the believers?
Okay, that's a question that I don't think I'm going to be able to fully answer. Because how you know, if we could answer that, that would be, well, let me partially answer it then. There's a difference between saying something is a necessary condition for something to happen and saying it caused it. So I will say, for example, that if I want to get into my building at work, it's necessary that I have my pass card. Okay, so I have to have it. Otherwise, if I swipe the elevator, it doesn't go up. Okay, so I have to have it. But my pass card is not sufficient to get in. I need to have it, but it's not enough. I have to also be able to press the button and go up and have my key to unlock the door and those things as well. Now, when I say something is necessary for something else, I'm not necessarily, if I can use the word there, making a causal claim. I'm not saying my pass card caused me access. I'm just saying it's a necessary condition. So for those who think that everything is predetermined for whatever reason, it still makes sense to say that there are certain necessary conditions or sufficient conditions. I can say, for example, that photosynthesis occurring is a sufficient condition to produce oxygen. But photosynthesis is not necessary to produce oxygen. I can produce oxygen other ways. There are other ways to produce oxygen, but it's a sufficient condition. Now, again, I'm not necessarily making a causal claim. I'm not saying photosynthesis causes oxygen. I'm just saying it's sufficient that I have this happening to have this happening. So the whole notion of necessary and sufficient conditions almost underpins the notion of causality, but you can talk about it without saying that one thing causes another. I suggest that to you as a way of accommodating the idea that everything is otherwise predetermined for things. So I mean, we can think about that in the natural world too. To use the language of necessary and sufficient rather than causing or causation might have some impact, if that makes sense.
Thank you. Yeah, it makes sense. And I have another question. Maybe I need a kind of a idea for a reference book rather, and that is a case studies in critical thinking about business scenarios. There are a lot of books which kind of give a general idea, and especially those cases which have already failed, or the cases of businesses which have already failed. They talk about them. What went wrong, like the case of Nokia, especially, that is famous as a case of critical thinking. So
Look,
I would ask.
There are many good books, but I'm reading this one right now. It's called the knowing, doing gap. There are many case studies. Very few of them talk about critical thinking explicitly, and this one doesn't either. Very few of them do, but this one suggests a lot of critical thinking, I think, in it.
Right.
So it's done by Harvard University Press, and I'm finding it quite fascinating in the distinction between just knowing something and then doing something with that knowledge, which is what I think of as critical thinking.
Right.
Anyway, I offer that to you as one suggestion.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay.
Nice talking to you.
And you, thank you. So I think we have some other questions in the chat box there.
Yes, sir. Abdullah, student of grade 10, wants to ask that how could we be able to remove fallacy in our argument while speaking to others?
That's a great question. And one of the advantages of developing good argument structure is that it makes clear where the fallacies sit. We've actually done a few papers on this issue. And if we don't have an argument structure, then we can make claims that are clearly fallacious. But if we take the trouble to set out our premises and our conclusion and structure our arguments, whether it's by analogy or by generalization or deductive arguments, whatever they may be, we can actually have them sitting up there and point to where it happens. We also use argument mapping quite a lot. And if you can map your arguments where every reason you have either joins with reasons, but all point towards a particular conclusion. So everything comes to a conclusion, points to a conclusion. That helps make your fallacies visible in thinking. So again, I would say more understanding of the techniques and structure of arguments will help with identifying where the fallacy of reasoning are happening. That's a good question too. And of course, talk a lot about fallacies and learn about them. That helps.
Thank you so much, sir. So there is another question from Sir Rashid. He wants to ask, can concept of critical thinking of poor economy be in comparison with developed economy?
I don't see why not. There are many developed economies in the world where poor thinking seems to be just as common as good thinking. I don't see the distinction between them. I mean, everything hinges on the quality of education, but it depends what you mean by quality of education too. It just doesn't necessarily mean well-funded. There's a lot of educational programs and structures which do not teach people to think critically terribly well. And it's not something that's resource intensive, to teaching people to think well. But I have to qualify that statement by saying the one absolutely important resource is the teacher. So really we are talking about quality of teachers here, and not just quality of teachers who know lots of content and can teach their content well. I mean, who know something about the pedagogy of teaching for thinking. That's our most critical idea. And I don't think, well, to whatever extent that is a function of the wealth of a country, I don't know. But I do know that there are wealthy countries that don't focus very well on teaching people to think well.
Thank you, sir. So we have another participant, Zainab Farooq, who wants to ask a question. Yes, Zainab.
Am I audible?
Yes.
Yes.
Well, I'd just like to base my question on that of Rashid Moghil, and I'd like to ask that can we compare critical thinking with economy? Like, is there any kind of relationship with them? Because critical thinking is, it deals with society more, and economy, it deals with society, but in another perspective. So can both of these two be related together somehow?
Yeah, that's very interesting. Thank you. I think the answer is yes, because there are several ways to understand this. One is that, we value in the modern era, we have a lot of value on the concept of the knowledge economy, where we value innovation. But in an economy, we define an economy not by what it consumes or distributes, but by what it produces. So a knowledge economy produces new knowledge. But the word we have for the production of knowledge is thinking. And we need good thinkers to make new knowledge. We can't make new knowledge just by turning the handle on some machine. It only happens through the quality of thinking. So I think that's a very strong relationship with the quality of thinking and the quality of an economy. But I also think that people who can think well can reason publicly very well together. And when we have good public reason holds our politicians to account more, and it makes our population less inclined to be manipulated so easily. And I think that has powerful economic benefits for all, rather than just making some people rich. So I think there's a very strong connection between critical thinking and the health of an economy in several ways. It's quite an interesting question. Thank you.
Thank you, Zainab. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Sir, I have a last question, if you don't mind asking me. What are what techniques do we need required to construct and reconstruct our arguments?
Well, it would be, as I mentioned before, the notion of argumentation. Now, I have developed with a colleague an online course on the edX platform, which deals a lot with argument structure. If you Google meta, I'll put the phrase in the chat box. If you Google Meta 101X, it's a course called Philosophy and Critical Thinking. Now, it does do some philosophy, but there's a lot of sections, and I do these sections, which is all about argument structure and argument evaluation. So if you'd like to look at some ways in which we do this, that course is available for you. It's on the edX platform. It's the Harvard MIT platform. And we've had about 130,000 people enrolled and go through that course. So it's quite a significant one. And it's a bit of fun too. It's meant to be done in about 4 to 6 weeks. That's quite short. But that might give you some indication of the devices you can use to analyze and evaluate arguments. So.
Thank you so much, sir. Now, I would like to invite Mr. Speaker, Dr. Peter, for his concluding remarks.
How long would you like me to take for my concluding remarks?
Sir, 10 to 15 minutes.
Okay, I think they'll just do 10 minutes, and that's
Sure,
that will see me through. So there's a couple of things that I might share with you, actually, and if you'll bear with me, I just want to pull them up on my screen. There is I suppose a set of conditions which are very interesting about classrooms and culture that facilitates good critical thinking. So I'd like to suggest what those are, or give you some of them at least. The characteristics, if you like, of a critical thinking classroom, or critical thinking activities. So I'll share my screen and all right, so characteristics of critical thinking activities. Okay, so what makes an activity a critical thinking activity, broadly speaking? And I think what I say now will make sense given the conversations we've just had as well. Firstly, there are activities, and I'm not suggesting, by the way, that every activity has to have all of these characteristics, but I think over time, you would want to see in a classroom that these kind of things happen, so that students will identify and challenge assumptions that people make. That's a fundamental aspect. and a creative aspect as well as an analytical one. That they will construct and evaluate arguments, just so important to the giving and taking of reasons is the core of critical thinking. That the students will question creatively themselves, like they'll generate questions themselves. That the activities will range of cognitive skills and processes. They won't just be, listening and recalling or even just analyzing. They'll also be evaluating and justifying and synthesizing and doing a range of different kinds of intellectual activities over the course of that content and activity. That they can frame and solve problems, not just solve problems, but actually frame problems, because as we've said before, the ability to frame problems in certain ways might challenge original assumptions. And we can now look at something in a way that we didn't see before, which allows possibilities that we couldn't see before. So framing and solving problems is important, and therefore working in novel situations that they have not yet seen, so that they have the ability to apply this knowledge in ways that are new to them. So they're doing something with the knowledge they've already learned, and that thing that they're doing is thinking about this new context. And critically, that they require collaborative inquiry and thinking, not just group work, not where we're dividing the task between people, you do that bit and you do that bit, but in fact, optimally in terms of thinking, when we are doing all parts of the activity together, which raises interesting problems about how to manage that, but that's what's really important about getting students to think well. So that's a really important idea. And those are some of the characteristics that you might think of as critical thinking classrooms. You might see this kind of thing happening on a regular basis. And you think, well, there's some thinking going on in those classrooms. And once students are engaged in these kind of activities, you then have the option of using those words of the values of inquiry. Once they're thinking, you can start talking about clarity and precision and relevance and significance and breadth and depth. But if they're not thinking, you don't get to use those words. There's no option, no opportunity to use those words. So that's importantly. And the last thing I'd like to leave you with is a publication that we've recently put out into the Journal of Educational Action Research, and it looks at what is required. So you can see the reference down below. It looks at what's required for teachers themselves to develop critical thinking in classrooms, and we see that there are 4 really key steps for teachers to do this properly. The first step is to work within theory. Now, that doesn't mean that we have to know some academic idea of what education is. It means that we have some mental model of how what we do will affect our students' thinking. Some idea of what we do will affect their cognitive activity. And we use that theory to construct the activities, and then we use the results of those activities to modify our theory and go back and think again and say, okay, well, that didn't work. Why didn't it work? And that we speak to each other about our thinking, not just sharing what we did, but critically explaining why we did it. If we don't do that step, then it just doesn't sink deeply into our practice. We just have a bank of resources on the shelf. We have to understand why they might work. So we need to talk to each other about why we think they work. Second step is to use resources that embed that pedagogical understanding. And that's one of the reasons that we produce the resources that we do, including the ones that you've seen here today, that help embed that understanding so that we can get them across. A third critical step is that teachers themselves have to now create their own resources based on their mental models, based on their ideas of why things work. Okay, so I'm going to modify this particular task so that it includes more justification and the ability to analyze and evaluate an argument. That's as simple as what we might mean by creating a resource, okay? Modifying a task to demand of students that kind of cognitive activity. And the fourth thing is that we work collaboratively to develop our expertise. So those four things are very important. So we end up today with the characteristics of a critical thinking classroom and the steps that teachers need to go through to teach it. Now, these are not short steps. This is not an algorithm to follow. This is not a quick process. It is about expertise development, and that is a long game. But it is about working collaboratively, and we've worked collaboratively with teachers for many years in developing their expertise in this area. So it's not something that happens quickly, but you can make very big gains very quickly in classrooms that do this. So I will leave with that information there, and thank you all once again for having me and hosting me today.
So much, sir. Thank you again. Now I would like to invite Sir Hassan Rahim, President PAS, for a vote of thanks.
Hello, for sparing such a precious time for PAS. Actually, PAS has been doing a lot for developing critical thinking in this particular country, Pakistan. And as you have very clearly stated that there's no far difference between the economies, the developing economies and the developed economies. And I would like to say, however, there is some sort of so far as the institutions are concerned, no doubt in it that there is a change where there are